It occurred to me that I'm all over the internet, on YouTube and other people's videos, making comments and stuff, and telling this story, which is the way that I see, um, really, uh, how you interpret the God story in the Old and New Testaments. Um, and so I thought I needed to make a video that pretty much told the same story, just going from start to finish. And that I would try to do that. And I wanted to preface the making of it, the telling of that story, with, of course, the introduction of the idea that this whole unique approach comes from finding the correlation that I found in the book of Acts between what goes on in Acts and the story of the prophets Elijah and Elisha's lives, as they're told in the Old Testament, and how you can just look at how they are implemented in the story of Acts, um, and that what that does is that it forces you to see it, the the relevant story, which is Acts, with a subtext. And then when you begin to look at that subtext, you begin to take everything apart. And, you know, you the role of the scribe, the person who is recording this stuff. Did they make something up? Is this a collaboration? Is this an understanding that that the people had who were at that level? Um, it certainly doesn't still go on today, though. But you can see that this story exists at that level. Uh, I mean, it's literary criticism. It's just everything, even through the book of Revelation in the New Testament, could be interpreted through in that light. That it's all about the the way that the story is manipulated by man, and not the influence of God. Um, I mean, maybe I choose to see God in all this because, I just have biases and everything, and that, and I have to accept that. It could just be that it's all, I'm just discovering some stuff that's always been there that we've interpreted incorrectly, but that because of finding this correlation, and then you discover the elements of literary criticism, that you get into this um, new world. But it doesn't discount that there is a God. It in fact, um, it it reinforces it in the same way, but that lots of things do, where you find some kind of comfort. Um, but what it does is it sort of definitively tells you that God deals with man on a kind of a like a corporate level. He's not dealing with individuals. He's not. We all have this. That's what Christianity is famous for. Is this approach to God where you're like, oh, he's my personal savior, but you see God approaching man on this corporate level, and not on an individual basis, and not on this very more selfish level of the individual, but on this big overall level. And that whole thing is based upon there being no condemnation, you know, and that's actually quite important and basic to seeing this. I better get started with the story, though, or I'll just carry this explanation through too. Okay, so starting at the start, That means we need to begin in Genesis. And we need to think about, well, of course, there are certain things that we could get lost in here, which is way. And the first thing is, how do we interpret who Adam and Eve were? They could have been, individual people that were meant to be like, literally 6,000 years ago, but they could also stand for, you know, um, bodies of people. Like we were just saying, God deals with man on a corporate level more than an individual level. But then when there's only two people to begin with, it's pretty hard for God to be entirely corporate and not individual. Yeah, so you do have that kind of thing going on and stuff. It's just that it's important because when you start thinking about the pantheon of other gods and how there could be things going on, and people talk about where Yahweh came from and how he was like a Canaanite god and all these different things. Um, as far as this story goes, and using the Bible only and not getting into those other things to interpret it, using the Bible to help us interpret the Bible, um, so that if it's a conveyed message meant to be conveyed through literature by people and deliberately done so, that we're more likely to get it if we use the Bible to interpret the Bible rather than being um, uh, you know too sure that we can just use the Bible to interpret the Bible. I mean, to know everything in terms of about the Bible, because it's important that we have information coming to us from archaeology and all that stuff too, telling us that pretty much a lot of these stories must be hokum. Yeah, because um, then we do understand some of the stuff better, and that God couldn't possibly have been such a monster in certain ways when the stuff isn't actually true. Yeah. So anyway, we got to start in Genesis. And where does Yahweh come from? Yahweh comes from when the Father, uh, when he made Adam, which I think what it means to here, to pluck him out of, to make him of clay, is in any rate, whether he's a group of people or he's an individual. The Father makes Adam, but what he does is he takes from the existing peoples. That is to say, the Father is looking for something to be present, and he's been using evolution all this time to generate it. But when he finds it in Adam, he separates him out and he says, "Okay, now um, this is something different than evolution, though. This is what I want to have, which is more representative of my nature, and so." I'm going to pour my spirit into him now because he's given me some signs enough that I see that he's the one, it's like you'd think billions of years and you're waiting for this, you're going to take the first opportunity you can, right? You're not going to wait around for another, 1,000 years or so of people to live and find another Adam. You're going to take this one. And yeah, he did. So, regardless of whether he passed the test or not, because maybe this is a rigged test and maybe it isn't. Man really came to life, as it were, when God breathed his spirit into him. That's where Yahweh comes from. Yahweh is meant to teach us about how to deal with things like evolution, you know, and whatnot, to give us some answers. But we decided we needed this really complicated way of looking at stuff. And if you want the truth of it, as I've spoken about in other videos, you know, the serpent must be the evolutionary paradigm. Um, and the the serpent in the garden, speaking to them, getting them to believe in the knowledge of good and evil as some kind of legitimate basis for thinking, something that infects us. And I was thinking, this even applies to how we think about God, because where do we get this God must be omni everything story that we carry on about what God must be like and all these different things? That doesn't come from. It comes. It doesn't. It comes from a place of what we have in our world of inherent biases, which, in some very subtle way, are very influenced by this story. That is to say, this is we're talking about. Where does it come from? We don't know about the infectious moment, or if it's not some kind of temptation you're always, as a thinking being, tempted to. But, to use judgment, to use the knowledge of good and evil, when what that story is really telling us is not that we're condemned, we're cast out of the garden because our state is not compatible with being in the garden anymore. Um, uh, because we're too complex now. And the garden isn't the place for us anymore. Uh, kind of, that's what Yahweh was. You see, because there's this thing that goes on next where God says, "Oh, what are we gonna do with them now that they ate of the tree?" You know, and now you see what looks like a council, but it's Yahweh was breathed out into Adam, and he couldn't take it. This complexity is too much. He wasn't really built for this. He wasn't breathed out for this, and so he needs to be fixed. But he can't be. But look, the first thing he does is he says, "Kick him out. Let's kick him out. Let's kick him out." So there's a sign here. That everyone misses, but it's a sign. The first thing that he says to the father here is, obviously they can't stay in the garden. They need to go out, you know? And this is God talking to God, but we have this thing, is this Yahweh's under a lot of stress, because this is too much for him. He's had to leave Adam, which is, surely you will die. Of course, is the absence of the spirit then being, is that Yahweh being with them means that they die. But it takes them 1,000 years to physically die. So we're wondering about the tree of life and all of that, and maybe they could live without having the spirit, and that's probably what the Father is ultimately trying to get at, or whatever, that man can stand on his own, um, because realistically, the situation that the Father finds himself in by doing this is in the situation that we have a metaphor for now, but we never really had for before, is like having a self-driving car, where you have still a human safety driver. And that's what it means for him to put his spirit in there in lots of ways, and to be afraid for us, to know um, this very complicated world that we could know. And so, it's good for the thing to have happened, but we see that the serpent is probably the evolutionary paradigm anyway, and it needs to have constant change, and it can't get any change. And this is interesting because we have the argument between reason and experience. And it's like, is man like created and born into existence, and doesn't need anything but pure reason, and there is no need for experience or anything, and that's what the garden is all about. It's just about pure enjoyment all the time, and everything, you know. And so we've gone into this different world where we need experience, but we always needed experience. It's just what we're talking about is, because, you know, just because I had an idea yesterday about how I wanted to develop my homestead property doesn't mean that today I haven't changed my mind. But we have this thing where we're locking God into not being able to change his mind and stuff about some pretty crucial things when it comes to man. So that's where Yahweh is. He's he's had this conversation with the Father. Let's kick him out, which was probably the right thing. You know, all in all these different things considered, because it really is about building us up and making us and creating us still, because this is all involved in creation. Um, Basically, I'm saying to you that I think that um, the creation isn't meant to be expressed just as a like a 6-day process with a seventh day rest. There's a pattern there, and that what God is also doing afterward, um, after the garden, for the next however many thousands of years, is all symbolized in what happens in uh, the original little creation story pieces. And like in, for instance, how, like, hasn't God already said, "Let there be light" and stuff, and then night and day, and then how is it that these celestial bodies are created in the fourth day? But that's because it's a that is a symbol for what's happening with Jesus and what takes place there at this time. But we're getting to that. What he sets up is something in the heavens. That you can recognize. Um, so, but the next thing that happens with Yahweh is he goes to Mount Sinai. Then, right, and he influences the patriarchs, and all these different things happen, and you have everything that takes place, and he goes in the ark. I've got all these videos about what the Ark of the Covenant is like, and then uh, that people should look at to understand a lot of my take as well. My viewpoint is heavily influenced by knowing there must be a God, because there can't be something like this going on and there not be a God, because this is definitely some kind of it's just that God's a little more tricky and once again corporate, you know, than some kind of individual relationship would would have. God doesn't come to me as I'm coming down out of heaven and I'm talking to you and telling you and I'm giving you voices or anything like that. God uses my own thinking, is how God works. And you have to always be wary that you could be falling into traps. I'm just telling you that, man, really the way the world is, in the way they so don't interpret religion the way that I'm trying to tell you, is this much more simple, easy way to understand it. And they get into these complex things that support, well, then we're going to make you guilty, you know. It's basically what it is. Give you these complexes, and I'm telling you there is no condemnation. So, I don't have any leverage. other than trying to get at the truth. So Yahweh's on Sinai. And what Israel is all about is the story of Noah. The whole reason why Israel's being put together is the Noah story. They have the ark. So Yahweh is overwhelmed by everything that happened when they ate of the tree, and now man is too involved in judgment, and he's all these things that didn't have to happen, but which we we had the choice to get into that complexity. And when we were in the garden, just to short circuit a lot of time that would have taken place, and we would have reached it. But we had the choice, and we short circuited it, and we went right to being complex. And like I say, it's not about condemnation. It's not about falling because of having the knowledge of good and evil. It's not about being like evil and wicked or anything, because you need to understand there is no good and evil. Just because we have this temptation to look at the world this way, the idea is that you need to understand these things don't exist, but you're tempted to see them. That's why when Jesus is tempted by the devil in the wilderness, there's important stuff going on with the language of how that's going. The temptation is taking place, where you understand that he's being tempted to see the world, uh, like to make it from when you consider that stones are in many ways analogs for talking about stories. That stones, Jesus is being tempted to take a story and make food out of it. Which is to say, to do the thing that happened in the garden, at the short circuit thing. Oh, and he's like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to. Well, let's go the harder way here. Yeah. So anyway, Israel is about Yahweh needing to be um, basically a fundamentalist, introducing all these rules and different things, and hurdle and turtle up, like that hockey term, the Colorado Avalanche, when they used to turtle up around Patrick Waugh. You hated it because you wanted them not to do that so much, because you just yeah, you're not going to have as many Stanley Cups, you know. But anyway, they they turtled up. He turtled up with Israel around him and his fundamentalist, nature and these things, and it was just as much as he could understand. Um, but it's also about giving, us the Old Testament and everything to see, you know, some light in, but and just tradition and everything else. And but there was always going to be an end to that. Because Yahweh wasn't meant to be just for some chosen people. Yahweh was always meant to be the teacher of all man and to be the blessing of all man. And this weird thing that we've got going on, where he's not also supposed to be the 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 driver. We're supposed to be growing up into that, being self-driving, and he's not supposed to be our emergency driver. He's not, and we want him to be so badly in lots of ways, but he's not supposed to be. And so God is working this really interesting thread about how this is going to have to happen, how he can bless man and have all these things take place, that he always wanted to have be for man. And so he turtles up in Israel, and then The Jesus story is about how he gets out of that. But it's about how he has to die. Yahweh has to die. But how can he do that? He can't. You know, he can't really go and be with any human being, because every time, like even with John, if John ate or drank something that was like something that, wasn't right in the, according to the fundamentalist traditions and principles, oh my gosh, I have to leave him. And so being able to die with somebody was not something that he could, everything you go through, but he could do that with Jesus, you know. Um, this is where you need to see it's very important. All these arguments people get into about, oh, yeah, but the God nature of Jesus, and that's unimportant to the core, because Jesus was more importantly the vessels for the death of Yahweh, um, than anything else. So that you should go back to the Father and come back out again at Pentecost and be rebreathed out on man, you know. And then there's all these things, from, of course, the story of Moses, where you see, children of Israel who are stubborn and all this stuff, and they didn't do things they were supposed to do, and they wound up suffering for 40 years in the wilderness and whatnot. And but there is the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus talked about it, and it was coming then. It has already come, um, and it came at Pentecost, and that's what we're talking about. It's the kingdom of heaven is how Yahweh comes and becomes man's, helper. That is man in general. Like, now we need to get then past the issue of Christianity and what Paul did. Okay, before I go too much further, I wanted to, make sure I talked about, John the Baptist and the importance of John the Baptist and Jesus, and the correlation that makes between different threads coming together, and the importance of it, of how those threads meet, and the correlation that I first spoke of at the beginning of all of this, that happens in the book of Acts, where we find out about Elijah and Elisha's lives, and that basically acts as a template for, which it gives us, an understanding about how God is working in the world as a spirit, you know, and what therefore, um, His work, yeah, that is Yahweh's work, um, is progressing, and, the things that it does, which you need to get into that more deeply to experience that, because I suddenly realized it to take hours to really, give examples. So anyway, so there's John, who is, when you have the story of Noah, which is, once again, we're talking about Noah and it being the flood story, which is the story of Yahweh having to turtle up and, be a fundamentalist. And so Noah, when he releases, when he, it's the end of the flood and everything else. So when we get to the point where God can come out of Israel, because he senses that it's the right time in the world, in the history of humanity, that is, because that's the whole idea, is about the progression, from, uh, being turtled up to getting to face man in a way where he could. And so you have this entry of Yahweh into the story again, in the same way that you have like the entry of Elijah the Tishbite, and then he's It's fed by the ravens at the brook. You have John the Baptist, who is Noah releasing, the raven. And then you have Noah releasing the dove after that. And the different things that those things are meant to convey in terms of, is it real enough to step out? And everything that's important about it being the dove, which came down upon Jesus at his baptism, symbolizes this kind of thing. That now you have, all of this. I could get into the correlation story and talk about it, but I don't want to get lost in that because I've already spoken about that so much in different videos. I just really wanted to get into this, talking about interpreting, what God is up to then. And so that because of everything that's brought about with how Jesus gave Yahweh a way to die, and he could come back and be humanity's God, humanity's helper, actually, but not in a different way than what we had experienced, where Yahweh had to be a fundamentalist. We're opening up, we're becoming more liberal. And I know, that rankles people, but I mean, you just have to look at it and just take a look. And don't enter it with bias from the garden when you think about it. And you'll see that it is that. He is presented as mankind's helper now. But that it's Paul who came along and messed everything up by saying that you had to have this faith in Jesus to be like in this new version of Israel, which is a new turtling up. But that actually what's really being conveyed in the story is that there was no condemnation. Paul introduces this idea that there was condemnation and you're going to hell, if you don't believe in Jesus, like there was condemnation before, but there was never condemnation before. It wasn't a fall. It was a short-circuiting on a corporate level directly into this complexity where Yahweh couldn't stay with Adam anymore, and he couldn't. That arc, that story arc, wasn't possible, and now we're in this much more tumultuous situation. And in order for God to be present in man at all, he needed to turtle up and be fundamentalist with Israel and have the law and all these other things. I get into another aspect of what this must mean, for there not to be condemnation, and then there to be this, now Yahweh is mankind's helper at large. And what does that mean? What is and I think, well, it must be things like democracy and how that is definitely something that since this point in time in history, we're talking about, from the resurrection till, the 21st century, that democracy and the importance of it, the importance of the understanding of the intrinsic importance of individuals, and that cannot have like 3/5 of a person there. You have a whole person always when you have a person, that respecting people at that level of at some kind of basic wholeness to your humanity, that it's important. And And so we have this suffrage, which extends out to all peoples now, which under Paul was not an extended suffrage that was extended freely. It was extended where they had to have like faith in Jesus. And God is actually saying, no, that's not what I'm doing. And so you have this lack of involvement, you know, that comes up, that people are always accusing God of things that they expect him to do when that wasn't what he's after in the first place. He's actually after trying to finish creating us corporately, you know, on this really big level of, helping us understand things like democracy, you know, and finance and very, very important high scale things. And here we go. Will we get the lesson? And one of those lessons is morality. So that's why, I talked about it here and there. Um, I think that, look at the progression out of the fundamentalist turtling up, and then you need something more liberal. But the approach that I think is that makes sense is that of right of way rather than this whole rule structure. It's understanding whose turn it is, and that it's okay for you to take your turn, and you don't have to do it in judgment. I think that's important. And I think that's what God is trying to get at too, for us, that we could have a different, better world. Because, we kind of, or we do, we stand in our own way. We're the ones who make all the zoning rules. We're the ones who make all of the rules that worship the rich, because, we feel a lack when we're not willing to be honest about how we don't have things because we did it to ourselves, maybe, or parents did to us, or whatever. We don't want to dishonor our parents. Different things go on. But we just need to heal. Yeah, and speaking of healing, one of the ways that you can do that is by bailing on Christianity in a way, and still understanding, the role of Yahweh and Jesus, and that there is something there, but it's not this Pauline message of accusation that, that you are unclean, or, fallen, and, it's not that. And that uh, there is this spirit, Yahweh, he's really, you can call him Jesus now because they're one, that is after still finishing the creation of humanity and making us whole, that it is our helper now. And so there you have this. You can even use the correlation in Acts with the prophets' lives to look at how people say that Acts is all about promoting Paul, and then you have this subtext, and it's not about promoting Paul. It's actually that Paul is Hazael, who is I'm coming at you out of the blue. If you haven't looked at the video, which is I put out, which is called "The Two Witnesses." And it goes into the correlation in detail and talks about how it comes about. And then Paul is Hazael, and it is that you say to yourself, well, if Paul were actually like the one who was the true message of Christianity were like carried on through him, wouldn't he be Yehu, son of Nimshi? But Yehu, son of Nimshi, is actually correlates with Cornelius and this other outpouring that happened. And you can see that that's a communication of that suffrage and the intention of God all along to be the God of all humanity, the helper of all humanity. That He wants man, though, to be full and grown and of the capacity for morality and the capacity for governance, self-governance, and all these different capacities God is trying to engender in man, right? That these are the things that we have to be thinking about when we're thinking about what God wants for man, and not like, well, I'm sorry, but hell is the place for you. It seems so ridiculous that we would be so caught up on all this thing about needing to get out of hell and all these different things and not realizing that you're not condemned in the first place. But I guess it's hard for us because we feel so alone and we want God to be closer to us. But, this is, and of course, nothing about what I said is going to help or fix any of that. But I was thinking it can help you if you're deconstructing and you're in this terrible place like where I was, and you're thinking, oh man, but I know there's a God. It's just that, you know, there's so much about what I've been told about God that can't be true. And you got to tear it apart and put it back together again. And that's what this story is really all about. It's about helping you to see there's a whole different way you could look at this. And that it's not necessarily that you have to give up on God. When you give up on Christianity, if you deconstruct and you make your life better and you put it back together, you take it apart, you put it back together again, and maybe you have fewer pieces you didn't use in like the model that you're putting that 10-year-old kid, that or like when I used to take apart the toys I had and wait a minute, where does this go? When I'd put it back together. Maybe that happens fewer and fewer times and you get it right, and your thing functions and that's better when it does. And helps you to understand. And yeah, hopefully I'm on that track too. I'm trying to get better and trying to understand. And anyway, I know I left a lot of stuff out, and I'm just trying to in this going through it. I wanted maybe to get into Revelation and stuff, but this is long enough now, and the continuation of things, and there's more teaching, and that'll be for the future at some point. But right now, I think I spoke about enough.